Now, I don't want anyone to misunderstand the title of this video, because the usage of the word persuasion is very connotative and differs from person to person. When I say persuasion, I am referring to a mode of influence characterized by emotion and rhetoric and charisma and other psychological tactics. This idea of the ideological salesman. I'm making a distinction between pathos and logos, the latter of which I'll be advocating for. The debate community seems to be split between two opposing philosophies regarding judges and their relationship to the role of the debater. On the one hand is the view that the debater's job is to persuade the judge, to adhere and adapt to their political preferences and biases to win the ballot. Under this view, it doesn't really matter if the debater actually wins the round at an argumentative technical level. The only thing that matters is if they successfully appeal to their judge more so than their opponent. On the other hand is the view that the debater's job is not to persuade the judge, but to prove to them that they have won the round at an argumentative technical level, right? The logic, the flow, the line by line, the preservation of premise to conclusion. Under this view, it doesn't matter whether or not a judge likes the debater's argumentation and style. The only thing that matters is if that debater successfully dismantles their opponent's position and/or defends their own. The difference between these two philosophies is the question of, is the judge there for us, or are we there for them? This conflict between models for debate needs to be settled if incidents like the one at Arizona are to be solved. Otherwise, debaters who are unfairly dropped by biased judges will continue to be told by coaches and tournament directors that it's their fault because they failed to persuade them.
It is a question of persuasive argument in front of that judge that ultimately lost you the debate. You all also definitely read arguments in front of him that were not going to be persuasive to him.
Now, I think this conflict can be settled easily by simply evaluating the long-term effects of each model. There are many problems with the persuasion model of debate. The first is the problem of echo chambers. In a debate space in which the vast majority of judges are to the far left, and you're tasked with persuading them, and you're not to the far left, you're going to lose most of your rounds from the beginning. Such an echo chamber would remove the intellectual diversity that makes debate possible and worthwhile. If you're familiar with the concept of intrinsic value, this is basically the inverse of that. The persuasion model of debate creates echo chambers which remove the condition for debate to happen, intellectual diversity. And if there's no debate, there's no need for persuasion. Persuasion as a model of debate is intrinsically bad because it necessitates its own obsolescence. Therefore, debate can't be about persuasion. And I'm not just talking about debate as a sport. Debate isn't about persuasion in real life either. I mean, even if we refer to persuasion as simply trying to convince someone you're right, that's also not the point of debate. It's not the right way to think about it. It's not that you're trying to convince someone you're right, it's that you're trying to propose to someone that you're right as an invitation for them to inspect and test your position and check for flaws. You're trying to see if they know something you don't, and simultaneously, how much you really know. This is the Socratic notion of knowing that you might not know. And it's a mutually beneficial process because either way, you both get closer to the truth. If they end up disproving you, then you both know where the truth is not. You know, people want to be right, but if you really think about it, you're right no matter what. Because if you're disproven, you now know even more than you did before. Your knowledge base is updated. By definition, you are more right than you were before. So it's very important that you don't go into a debate with the objective of changing someone's mind because you know you're right, because you don't. Right? The dialectical process isn't characterized by two abstractions overpowering each other. It's two abstractions colliding and filling in whatever gaps there may be, and what comes out of that, the synthesis, is better. If debate were merely a process of changing minds, there'd be no synthesizing, no new ideas would be generated, and there'd be no intellectual progression, only intellectual redistribution. Debate is about testing positions and entertaining ideas and evaluating premises and conclusions, practicing logic, right? That's why we talk about links, internal links, and impacts, because we are experimenting with the rules of logic. Now, before we continue, we should acknowledge why this persuasion misconception is so pervasive in the debate community. And part of the reason for that is that there's a constant flow of lay judges, people who don't understand debate, but are volunteering to judge because the tournament needs judges. There's a low judging pool. These people often have very little exposure to debate. Brief accounts of polemic debate in which politicians argue against each other, and then the applause of a crowd is the indication of success. And so the notion that you can consistently, almost to a degree mathematically, determine the winner of a debate round is alien to them. Such a system seems impossible. Now, in debate, that system is called the flow, the line by line. It's a visual representation of the logical progression of arguments in the round. And arguments that make it towards the end, that flow through, are regarded as true. For example, if your opponents win the argument that bringing more immigrants to America would force them to participate in capitalism, but you win the argument that capitalism is good, then you win the round, even if your judge hates capitalism. Now granted, this depends on the judge's ability to flow, and obviously the debater's ability to articulate what's happening on the flow. But when done correctly, the winner of the round can be easily determined. This is the difference between the judge deciding who wins the round versus determining who wins the round. The rules of logic have already decided who's won the round. The judge just has to figure it out. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, wait a minute, Michael. Even if I were to agree with you that debate isn't about persuasion, that's not going to change the judges. They're still going to vote off of persuasion, so shouldn't I change my style to win? And my response to that is no, it doesn't matter. Winning a high school debate round is not more important than developing critical thinking skills and exercising your mental faculties, especially when the judge awarding you that win knows nothing about debate. It's worthless. And even then, you can't guarantee that you will win the round, because what's persuasive to one judge might not be to another. It's not under your control, so you shouldn't let that determine how you debate. This kind of goes back to the Stoic idea of not worrying about things outside of your control. You be the best that you can be, independent of external factors. Now, the analogy I like to use to explain this is, imagine you go to a mathematics tournament in which the person who writes out the most correct math equation wins the round, but your judge knows very little about math, especially not the advanced math that you do at the tournament. Or maybe you have a college student for a judge who thinks that math is a foul logocentric instantiation of the patriarchy, which excludes the racialized other, ontologically speaking, or whatever. In that scenario, you have two options. You can write the equation that you were planning on, the one that you think is most correct, and risk losing the round because your judge doesn't understand it. It's too high level, or perhaps your opponent's equation just looked prettier. Option two is, instead of writing that equation, you simply write whatever equation you think that your math judge who doesn't know anything about equations will like. You don't go for the most correct version of the equation, but you don't care. You just want to win the round. And let's say you do. What was ultimately gained? A ballot? A piece of paper at a high school mathematics tournament? A trophy? However, in the first option, in which you do write out the equation that is most correct, you become better at math. You become smarter. You progress. Sure, you don't win the round, but comparatively, does that matter? I mean, even if you spent the entire math season losing round after round after round because your judges don't know anything about math, but you don't care, you decide that you are going to do the best that you can do, you would still have progressed far more than someone who won every round but never wrote a correct math equation. Sure, they learned how to look like they're good at math, but what benefit is that to anyone, if not extremely detrimental? And to clarify, I'm not saying that you can only argue positions you agree with. If you only entertained ideas that you already believed in, you would never progress intellectually. Instead, what I'm saying is whatever argument you choose to employ in the round should be exclusively interacted with logically by both you and your opponent, and evaluated as such by the judge. The reason why I like to use math as the analogy is because that's what debate is. Debate is a logical sport, and math is the purest form of logic. I mean, people like to say that Lincoln Douglas is the morality debate, and they synonymize that with emotion, but morality isn't emotion. Morality is logic, because morality is what's right and wrong, and what's right and wrong depends on what your values are. So it already functions as a function, right? You have inputs and then outputs. You input the value of human life, right? And then that gives you an output that any situation that infringes on human life is wrong. Whether or not something is wrong depends on the inserted value. It's a function. It is a mathematical concept. That's what morality is. In the same way that I can draw on a board a math equation and someone can evaluate whether or not it is correct consistently, you can determine whether or not a position was successfully upheld, whether or not an argument was coherent, whether or not an argument flows through. Persuasion isn't necessary and can often lead you astray if you make it the determinant of truth. You end up voting for the person who sounded better instead of the person who argued better. Now, in addition to the long-term individual benefits of the debaters, I don't see any societal benefit in training students how to move crowds with words, how to persuade them, how to manipulate them and pull on their emotions. We don't want to be training demagogues. We want to be training thinkers. And it's ironic that there's such a pushback against the idea of the politician. right? A politician who is disingenuous and will say anything to get the vote. And yet that's the model they're proposing we train our students to think? That's the future they want to create? The model of debate in which you teach your debater that it is their job to adapt to their judge's preference and convince their judge to get inside of their head and make them agree with them is a horrifying model for society. This is the difference between the politician and the philosopher, the demagogue and the thinker, the rhetorician and the logician. It's the difference between sophistry and Socrates. Now, if you don't care about any of that and you'd rather sound like you're right with emotion and rhetoric and persuasion, then you can have the speech events. That's what they're for. But debate is not about persuasion.